Hi, and welcome to this, the third lesson in the series of Superannuation Basics. I'm Scott Trevor, the Managing Director and founder of Go Global Bookkeeping. And it's my great privilege to introduce to you today some more complex sort of processes and topics around the superannuation environment. Now, the superannuation legislation itself is quite thick. It's quite a complex area of Australian tax law. And it covers businesses and taxation, and it's quite complex. So we're not going to delve into the very, very granular details of superannuation. I'm going to keep it still light. But still in this lesson, I'm going to be going through some of the complexities that are involved in superannuation. So in the first couple of lessons, we've learned of the origin of superannuation, why it was necessary in an aging population when you've only got a population of 26 million in Australia. And a low tax base, why it was necessary for people to start saving, when they can take that superannuation and what its ultimate purpose is for, and who it covers, which is now everyone who works is covered under the superannuation scheme. So in this lesson, we're going to delve into some more complex topics. So let's just rip into that, shall we? First of all, this notion of preservation age. Now, what that simply means is that when they make compulsory superannuation, when they take 9.5% of your salary, which is what the rate currently is, and they put it into a superannuation fund on your behalf, when can you get that money? Now, you can get that at your preservation age. Now, the reason they don't just say age 65 or age 60 or age 55 is because everyone's preservation age differs. Now, it used to be 55. It used to be once you're at age 55, you could retire, kick your feet back up, sip mojitos on the beach and have a great old time with your superannuation fund. Now, that was okay for older generations, but for younger generations, that wasn't the case. They had to increase the preservation age because the gap between how long people were living and when they stopped earning income was getting larger and larger and larger. So every advance in medical technology, which keeps us alive for longer, means that we spend more money, which means that we have to work later on towards that date. Robbing Peter to pay Paul, if you ask me, but that's only if you believe in the afterlife, which I do. Praise Jesus. Now, before 1960, if you were born before 1960, that is, your preservation age is 55. Let me say that again. If you were born before age 1960, your preservation age is 55. Then if you were born between 1960 and 1964, that preservation age pushed out to the current preservation age, which is age 60. So that's where it currently sits. So your preservation age for me, I was born in 1967. I know I don't look it. But my preservation is age 60. So I'm not allowed to touch my superannuation until I reach that gay old age of 60. I can't even consider retiring if I want to take my superannuation and live off that at that time. So that's what your preservation age is. Now, they're talking about for younger people who might live longer and longer than I, they'll keep pushing that preservation age out to 65 and then to age 70 before you're allowed to retire. So that's what the preservation age is. Conditions of release is another term that you should know. You can't take your superannuation until you meet a condition or conditions of release. And as that term means, the trustees won't release those funds to you until certain things happen. Now, the first one is you have to reach your preservation age. You can't take your superannuation if you haven't reached your preservation age. There are some limited exceptions, and I'll go through that, but typically you have to reach your preservation age. Secondly is you have to permanently retire from the workforce. Now, there's some minor exceptions to that with a thing called a transition to retirement, and I'll go through that in a second. But generally speaking, if you just think about it, you've got to meet a condition of release, which is that you're permanently retiring and you've met your preservation age. In my case, it's when I turned 60. If I permanently retired from the workforce, that is, I wasn't being paid by Go Global or anything else, then I can take my superannuation. Defined benefit fund. Now, it's important to understand that this term exists. It's an old-fashioned term. We're getting rid of most of the defined benefit funds. They were typically for industrial workers and the government, the kind of funds that were set up back in the 1800s. those funds are no longer in existence. And the reason that there was a big problem with them was because they guaranteed you a salary for life. So when you retired, so if I work for the public service, then they might guarantee that I was going to get 50% of my wage when I ended up, or maybe even 70% of the wage that I ended on for the rest of my life, as long as I live. Now, if I die early, that's a win for the government. If I die late, then that's a problem for the government. When they did an audit back in the 1980s, they discovered that there was this unfunded liability both in the Australian scene. For all the public servants that were owed all this money, there wasn't enough money in the government coffers to pay them. So that was why the defined benefit funds were gradually changed over to the rest of the superannuation scheme. But when you're in a defined benefit fund, you are allowed to retire at age 55. So the preservation age for the defined benefit fund is 55 still. I mentioned the limited exception about being permanently retired. So you can do a thing called a transition to retirement pension. And that is when you take part of your superannuation balance and you use that to supplement your income while you might reduce your days. You know, you're moving from full-time work to part-time work, and instead of reducing your income, you're just taking some of your pension along the way. Now, there can be some good tax strategies for doing this. Most of those tax strategies have now been eradicated. So there's not as much benefits of doing a transition to retirement pension as there used to be. I won't get into the complexities of that at all in any of these lessons. Suffice to say that it is still there, and when you're when you've met your preservation age, so in my case when I was 60, up to age 65, I could take between 4 and 10% of my pension and leave the rest growing. So I could still work, I didn't have to permanently retire, but I could take between 4% of my fund and 10% of my fund. Now that's what the fund's balance is. So if I had $100,000 in my balance that I'd worked all the years and added to, then I could take between $4,000 and $10,000 a year as additional income to me. And that was taxed differently as well. So concessionally, because I'll explain the tax situation to you a bit later. You can't take a transition to retirement pension as a lump sum. So you can't just say, okay, cool, I'll have 10K because I want to buy a car and I haven't retired yet. That doesn't work. You've got to take it as a pension if you're going to do that. And as I say, that's only between when you met your preservation age and age 65. You can do this wind down arrangement. And as I say, the idea is you cut the number of days that you're working out. You know, I start off working full time, then I work 4 days and 3 days, and you supplement that missing income with your superannuation fund. So you're not losing any income while you're doing that. Lump sum or pension. So when you've met your preservation age and you're willing to take your superannuation benefits, you can still take them as a lump sum or as a pension over a period of time. So you can take a pension, and there's minimum amounts that the government will mandate depending upon how old you are. Now, the superannuation system is designed to provide age pensions for you. So the minimum amount is based on your life expectancy table, so who you are and all the other things. And it's meant to run out before you die. Or sorry, just after you die. So in an ideal scenario, you would have spent all your superannuation fund and then you die the next day. Of course, people are worried about spending their super too early, and most people die with superannuation balances still in existence. So they haven't spent enough. You can still take lump sums. It is your money after all. So once you've met a condition of release, that is you're permanently retired, and you've met your preservation age, you can still take the lump sum and buy the car and the house and everything else that you want to do. And sometimes there's good financial reasons to do that. So that's important to know as well. Transfer balance cap is another term that's just something that's come in recently that's had a massive impact on the superannuation environment. Now, the transfer balance cap is $1.6 million, and that's expected to be indexed over the years. But it's important to know the $1.6 million cap is what's in place right now. And what that means is that's the amount of assets that you're allowed to have invested, $1.6 million worth, to support your age pensions. Now, in my way of thinking, 1.6 million is a lot of superannuation to have, It would cover you for the 20 years of your life, remember, because that's earning money and that's not being taxed. I'll explain the tax environment. It's enough to pay your pensions and live a pretty good life. I think 1.6 million Australian dollars. That's around about 400 million pesos. So it's a lot of money. Some people, some superannuation funds, which is why this rule was brought in, had up to $80 million to support age pensions, which is an obscene amount of money to have, their earnings weren't taxed, which is why people were doing it. The average balance apparently was $8 million. So there was a lot of very affluent Australians that had put a lot of money into superannuation, and they did that because the tax rate on pensioned income was nil. On the earnings from pension assets, investments, is nil. So they were getting a tax-free, tax advantage on all of that money. So the system changed just very recently in the last couple of years to change that to $1.6 million. So that's an important number to remember as you transfer balance cap. And just think about it, that's the most superannuation I'm allowed to have is 1.6 million. And it's for me, so my wife can have 1.6 million as well. So believe me, that's a lot of money. You're living a very good retirement with 1.6 million each. Next one is early access. So there are certain conditions of release that you can do. You can take part or all of your superannuation balance before you reach your preservation age or before you permanently retire. Now they are in temporary incapacity. So in certain circumstances, if you can't work for a period of time, your trustee can release you part of your superannuation to live on if you're say extendedly sick. If you're critically or terminally ill, so you can often take, if you're going to die within the next 2 years, then that's a condition of release and your trustees can give you your superannuation. Hey, live large while you can or pay your medical bills, one of those two. If you're under extreme financial hardship, and I mean extreme financial hardship, then there's certain cases that the commissioner can use his discretion, that's the tax commissioner, to give you part of your superannuation balance to help with you with various things. But the whole environment is really tight. They do not want you to take your superannuation early because then you'll have to rely on the government to pay you when you're in old age. So unless you're dying, they're not really that interested in releasing your superannuation before you retire and before you hit that age 60 or 65 or whatever your retirement age is. So that's important to know. Now on death, your superannuation balances don't form part of your estate. So the trustees don't have to pay it in accordance with your will, but you can make binding death nominations. That's another term that you should know, binding death nomination, for the trustees to say, we force you to pay it to a certain person, or the trustees will generally pay it to your beneficiaries anyway. But it's important to note that it doesn't form part of your overall testamentary estate or the estate when you die. But it does typically get paid out to dependents and you can direct it. There's different tax treatments on the payout of superannuation funds depending upon whether someone's a financial dependent or not. Mostly they're paid out to dependents but not financial dependents. So say you're adult children and it's taxed, but taxed at a concessional rate. Contributions. So there's two different types of contributions. One is called a concessional contribution, and that's where you get a tax deduction for it. Now, employers compulsorily have to pay 9.5% of a person's salary over. Now they get a deduction for the whole of the person's salary, including that 9.5%. So if you're not supported, or to top you up, I'll explain the cap limits later, but if you want to top yourself up, you can get a tax deduction for your superannuation contribution. So you don't pay tax on them. So they go into the fund before tax. Then they're taxed in the superannuation fund at 15 cents in the dollar. So that's a good tax rate. It's a very cheap tax rate. And any earnings in your superannuation fund that are not used to cover pensions are also taxed at 15%. So 15 cents in the dollar. So it's a very tax advantaged area to be in. And they're called concessional contributions. So concessional contributions are those contributions where you've got a tax benefit and the fund taxes them at 15 cents in the dollar. You've also got non-concessional contributions, and they're contributions that you've made with after-tax dollars. So you've just said, okay, I'm going to make some extra savings and I'll put an extra amount of money into my superannuation fund. Because they come from after-tax sources, they're not taxed by the fund. The earnings are still taxed at 15 cents in the dollar, or they're tax-free if they're supporting age pensions, but they're called non-concessional contributions. Now, there are contribution caps that are important to know. So take these down. So for this current income year, which is the year ended 30th of June 2019 that we're coming up to, and for the last couple of years, the contribution cap for concessional contributions that are part of your salary, or if you're not supported by a salary, individual workers or sole traders, all these people can get a tax deduction up to $25,000. So it doesn't matter whatever else you're doing. If your 9.5% of your salary comes to less than $25,000, you can top it up to a maximum of $25,000. So that's the maximum of all of your concessional contributions. So that's where the concessional contribution cap comes in. Now the non-concessional contribution cap is $100,000. So they don't want you just chucking a whole bunch of money into a tax advantaged environment, but you can put $100,000 a year into superannuation up to age 65. So after that you can't, but before that you can. Now, what's important to note is you can also bring forward 3 years of non-concessional contributions if you want. So you can put $300,000 into it at once, but then I won't be able to put any in the next year or the year after. And it just depends upon what year the money actually goes to the superannuation fund. So I can put a lump sum of up to $300,000 in as a non-concessional contribution, or just $100,000 a year all the way up to age 65. The thing about non-concessional contributions that's really important is you can only make non-concessional contributions up to your $1.6 million cap. Now remember, I said that was called a transfer balance cap. So remember that term. It doesn't really make any sense in the context of what we're talking about. Some call it a retirement cap, but that's what it's called, a transfer balance cap, and it's $1.6 million. So you're only allowed to make contributions, that is non-concessional contributions, up to your $1.6 million cap. So if you had more than $1.6 million to start with, there's transitional arrangements, but the idea is for people like me who didn't have $1.6 million in my superannuation fund, that's all I'll ever be allowed to get my cap up to, my balance up to. The $1.6 million is the top. That's about all. I think I've covered a lot in this session. In the next session, we're going to talk about tax. So in this session, we've really talked about a whole bunch of terms around preservation age and retirement and how the whole thing actually works in the superannuation environment. We've talked about the different types of funds, although we'll get into that in more detail. We've talked about when you can take the money and what a condition of release might be. In the next session, we'll talk specifically about tax.